Hello, ladies and gentlemen. How are empires experienced? On page 340, Unit 18, British decolonisation in the Middle East, Chapter 3, Palestine from 1920 to 1936. During the first years of the civil administration, which was set up in 1920. A beginning was made on the one hand with the provisions of public services, which mainly affected the Arab majority of the population, and on the other hand, with the establishment of the Jewish national home. There were outbreaks of disorder in 1920 and 1921, but in 1925 it was thought that the prospects of ultimate harmony between the Arabs and the Jews seemed so favourable that the forces for maintaining order were substantially reduced. These hopes proved unfounded because although Palestine as a whole became more prosperous, the causes of the outbreaks of the 1920 and 1921, namely the demand of the Arabs for national independence and their antagonism to the national home, remained unmodified and were indeed accentuated by the external factors, namely the pressure of the Jews of Europe on Palestine and the development of the Arab nationalism in neighbouring countries. These same causes brought about the outbreaks of 1929 and 1933. By 1936, the external factors have been intensified by the suffering of the Jews in Germany and Poland, resulting in a great issue of Jewish immigration into Palestine, and the prospect of Syria and the Lebanon soon obtained the same independence as Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Egypt was also on the eve of independence. These disturbances, which are briefly summarised, were familiar in character to the four previous outbreaks, although more serious and prolonged, as in 1933. It was not only the Jews who were attacked, but the Palestine government. A new feature was the part played by the rulers of the neighbouring Arab states in bringing about the end of the strike. The underlying cause of the disturbance of 1936 were the desire of Arabs for national independence, their hatred and fear of the establishment of the Jewish national home. These two causes were the same as those of all the previous outbreaks, and have always been inextricably linked together on several subsidiary factors that the more important were the advance of Arab nationalism outside Palestine, increased immigration of Jews since 1933, the opportunity enjoyed by the Jews for influence public opinion in Britain, Arab distrust in the sincerity of the British government, Arab alarm at the continued Jewish purchase of land, the general uncertainty as to the ultimate intentions of the military power. 1936 rebellion. The Peel Commission and the White Paper had exposed and politicised the problem beyond Palestine, engaging the rest of the Arab world. The Second World War would only postpone the wider and unavoidable conflict ahead, as in 2016. Germany's rearmament and territorial demands, meanwhile, made Britain eager to court Arab goodwill in the region ahead of any conflict, so Britain made its last pre-war effort to reach a Palestinian settlement. The White Paper of May 1939 set out its new proposals. It stated unequivocally that it was no part of Britain's policy that Palestine should become a Jewish state, and declared that Palestine would become an independent Arab Jewish state in 10 years. According to Balfour Paul, the 1939 White Paper's general pro-Arab slant aroused violent Zionist protest without satisfying Arabs' leaders. Despite their reluctance, agreed that in a war against Hitler, they had little choice but to support the British. We must assist the British in the war if there was no white paper, and we must resist the white paper as if there were no war. While the pacification of regional rivalries and sensitivities may primarily serve the contingencies of empire had largely worked until now, the impact of the Second World War and rise of the Cold War tensions would expose its limitations. 1914, German forces threatened to sweep British out of Egypt before belated victory of the Second Battle of the El Alamein turned the tide. Meanwhile, the British use of Jewish and Arab allies and increased wartime controls stored up further trouble for after the war. Egypt had declared independent in 1922, but Britain had been left specific rights in a limited number of areas. The Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936 further restricted Britain to the area immediately around the Suez Canal. It also went on to suggest that in 1956 Britain might withdraw completely provided Egypt could defend itself. Under the 1936 agreement, Egypt was also obliged to make facilities available in Britain in the event of war. After 1939, it hosted thousands of British and Commonwealth troops at the Suez Canal Zone base, Britain's main military base for the Middle East. Thus, Egypt became the target of Axis military operations. However, the defeat of German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November of 1942 marked of the beginning of the end of the Axis threat to Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the Middle Eastern and the Persian oil fields. During the previous year, on 29th of May 1914, the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, in his Mansion House speech on the British war aims, sought to rally Arab goodwill by promising full support for any scheme of Arab unity which commands general approval. What this meant in policy terms was never expand upon. However, to modify the many varied Arab nationalist groupings, the Arab League, under Egyptian leadership, was established on the 22nd of March 1945 with British support. Let's now take a look at an editorial extract following the signing of the character of the Arab League, publishing in the Manchester Guardian on the 26th of March 1945. The Manchester Guardian was a broadly left-wing newspaper sympathetic to calls for more autonomy for colonial peoples. What does the extract suggest about the reality of the Arab unity? What, if any, is the significance of the newspaper's editorial stance? The Charter of the Arab League, which was signed at Cairo last week, is an impressive tribute to Arab diplomacy, for Arab unity is by no means the simple and natural thing which it is sometimes represented to be. In reality, Syria, Transjordan, Iraq, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and the Yemen, the members of the League, are divided by almost as many disputes and differences as the states of Europe. To mention only the most important of these, there are the deep suspicion of the strict Wahhabis in the south for the looser forms of Islam, the ancient hostility between the primitive Arabs of the desert and the civilized Arabs of Syria and Lebanon, and the dynastic feud between the Hashemite dynasty, which was still rules in Iraq and Transjordan, and in King Ibn Saud, the masterful conqueror who holds the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, for which King Hussein originally came. In spite of these obstacles, the rulers of the seven states had agreed on the charter to coordinate their interests and to protect their independence and integrity. There is no doubt that the League should benefit the Arab peoples in many ways. It will also greatly increase their bargaining power with the Western nations, for it is no criticism of the League to say that it is biased in anti-imperialism. As an inevitable and healthy reaction against all foreign interference. The fact must be faced, however, that the result may not always be congenial to the British and French governments. As Balfour asserts its final form, the pact endorsing the independent statehood of all its signatories, it looked for the time of incautious enough. However, it would soon be apparent that the British technique of mixing formal control and informal power was to be constrained in the new ways by rising tensions in the US and the USSR, which were both nominally anti-colonial yet rival Cold War superpowers. An empire preserved oil, the Cold War, and the Middle East in the age of Nasser. As Peter Sluggett notes, the importance of oil and yet its discovery in Iran in Iraq 1908, Iraq in 1927, and in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia in 1930s, combined with the perceived threat of communism, inevitably changed the focus of British and other interests of the region. 1999, increased desire to acquire Middle Eastern oil, particularly by the United States and the Soviet Union, would play an internal role in the course of the Cold War in this region. Carefully read the following extract from Sown Crisis, the Cold War and American Dominance in the Middle East by Rashid Khalidi, and the answer to the following question. According to Khalidi, what were some of the key factors leading to increased importance of acquiring Middle Eastern oil by the United States and Soviet Union? The fact that as early as 1945, both the United States and the Soviet Union were paying considerable attention to the Middle Eastern oil does call for some explanation. Both powers were major producers of oil. The world's two greatest both had considerable reserves, and both had traditionally enjoyed self-sufficiency in oil production. Indeed, in 1941, the United States was the world's largest oil producer, with 63% of world production, with the USSR second, with 10.7%. In this respect, they were in far better position than all the great power rivals during the first half of the 20th century. Germany, France, Japan, and Italy had limited or no domestic sources of oil. Even as the development of air and land transport and the various new forms of military technology drastically increased demand for this vital commodity and made it considerably more strategically important than ever before. Even the great British Empire was dependent upon faraway supplies of oil. In distant and unstable lands, notably Iraq and Iran, World War II, however, had further underlined the crucial and growing strategic importance of oil, which was coming to play a more vital role in warfare than it ever had before. Now, not only fleets of ships, as in earlier conflicts, but also growing fleets of trucks, tanks, and planes were completely dependent upon oil products for propulsion. The armies of all the powers still use railways and animal transport, but their increasingly crucial mechanized forces were entirely dependent on oil byproducts, as were their air forces and navies. The vital nexus was increasingly apparent to all Allied war planners. It was clear, in particular, to American military strategists, who by 1944 directed a major proportion of US Army forces' strategic bombing offense against oil production, storage and transport facilities in Germany and Japan, and the countries under their occupation. Thus, in June 1944, the man in charge of the European portion of this bombing campaign, the commander of the USAAF Strategic Air Force in Europe, Gen. Karl Spaatz, issued an order to his commanders that the primary strategic aim of the US Strategic Air Forces is now to deny oil to enemy air forces. By this point, a valuable lesson about the strategic importance of oil in wartime had clearly been learned by the top levels of the American military command. It was learned effectively by the end of the war. American bombing of the German oil facilities had been so devastating that on both the eastern and western fronts, German panzers could not move and the Luftwaffe could not fly for lack of fuel. If both American and Soviet leaders and strategists came to understand the vital importance of denying oil to their enemies, in order to achieve victory, their own frightening wartime experiences gave both of these allies reasons to be concerned about their own oil supplies in the future. The Nazi offensive southeastward toward the Caucasus in the spring and summer of 1942 had been directed in large part at depriving the USSR of its fuel supplies from the rich Baku oil fields, the country's main source of oil. Had the great 1942 Wehrmacht assault that was finally brought to a halt in the Stalingrad succeeded. It might have crippled the Soviet war effort by depriving it of oil and perhaps changed the course of the war. Similarly, had the southern arm of the German pincers, led by the Afrika Corps, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and including Italian forces, managed to break through the British defences in North Africa. Not just Egypt and the Suez Canal, but also the oil fields and the refineries of the Middle East, on which a large part of the Allied war effort in that region depended, would have been vulnerable. Meanwhile, the massive German U-boat offensive of 1942, directed in large measure against Allied tankers in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, if successful, could have a similar effect of cutting the fuel supply across the Atlantic to Britain and for the Allied operations in the entire European theatre. Thus, during the early hours of the war, each of the three great victorious powers had suffered a serious scare relating to their own oil supplies and facilities. Britain had been conscious of its vulnerability in this regard since the moment before the World War I, when it took the momentous decision to make its fleet, previously fueled by coal readily available at home in the United Kingdom, dependent on the Middle Eastern oil supplies. Such issues were now new to American and Soviet war planners. Moreover, by 1945, both the United States and the Soviet Union were aware that their economies' rapidly growing need for oil, stoked by increased wartime demand, might soon outstrip their respective domestic supplies. In the case of the United States, by 1945, demand for refined petroleum products were already beginning to exceed supply. If one does not count production in Mexico, Venezuela, and the Caribbean, one major impact of the increased American interest in the Middle Eastern oil of Britain's empire was the shifting of American foreign policy objectives. These include taking advantage of British economic weakness to accelerate imperial disintegration. In 1940s drift containing USSR expansionism through the Anglo-American coalition, with some arguing that this, in effect, temporarily preserved empire. Lewis and Robinson, 1944. By 1947 to 48, Britain was economically exhausted from the cost of its war effort and being propped up financially by the United States. In doing so, the US indirectly supported British powers overseas, stabilising Britain's balance of payments for the domestic cause of saving the global free market from communist annexation. This is found in Lewis and Robinson, 1944, page 493. It would be in Britain's informal empire in the Middle East that Anglo-American collaboration come to the fore. Furthermore, in Indian independence in 1947 and a hasty British departure from the Palestine in 1948, along with the subsequent creation of Israel, seemed to make Britain's remaining hegemony in the Middle East more, not less, important, as well as more problematic. The Palestine departure came swiftly on the heels of Britain's growing realisation from 1946 to 48 that Arab and Jewish tensions were creating a spiral of violence which threatened to become uncontrollable. a British presence in the area, British officials and politicians concluded, would ultimately damage the country's reputation with both the Arabs and the United States. It then handed over the problem of resolving Arab Jewish tensions in 1948 mandate to the United Nations, which recommended partition. Britain ended its mandate in May 1948, whereupon the ensuing Arab-Israeli war resulted in Israeli victory and mass of Palestine refugees. The role of the UN in Palestine and Israeli have reflected a broader change. After 1945, power shifted to a global stage. Exercised by multinational companies, the international media, and an array of supranational, inter, and non-governmental organisations. Thompson, 2018. For Britain, the signing of the Charter of the United Nations in June 1945 and its coming into force the following October exposed the paradox of an international politics meant to advance rights and freedoms that existed alongside simultaneous employment of systemic, brutal counter-insurgency methods such as those used in Palestine between 1947 and 1948 and later in Eden. At the same time, the anti-colonial theoretic universalism and the exploration of human rights become increasingly prominent on the international stage. What followed from the United Nations 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, the 1949 Geneva Conventions that sought to protect non-combatants in war, and 1950 European Convention on Human Rights. The increasing emphasis on internationally agreed rights and protections was in tension with the expedient realities of counter-insurgency campaigns in places such as in Aden, where many rights were suspended, but where a facade of legality and thus legitimacy remained essential. While this period witnessed, as Mark Mazawa put it, the strange triumph of human rights, it occurred alongside renewed British efforts to remain principal foreign power in the Middle East, as we'll see in the next section. In the Middle East, 1950s, a Cold War at times, a convenient justification for policies which were being followed because of the opportunity they gave for reward British presence and thus great influence and regional domination. However, the Cold War, regional alliances such as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, membership from 1914 onwards had implications for British defence expenditure, which became stretched between NATO requirements and imperial interests. Complicating this too were the radicalised of Arab policies in the form of Nasserism. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser offered a patent brand of secularist Arab socialism. Combined with pan-Arab nationalism, this was a very different vision of the Arab identity from that of Britain's preferred Hashemite partners, the kings of the Transjordan and Iraq. Hence, there was also intense inter-Arab rivalry. Britain struggled on, working with partners in Jordan, Iraq and elsewhere, to which it was able to provide weapons and training, but it suffered a further fall in prestige in the Arab world following. The ill-fated Suez invasion of the autumn 1957, however, while Britain failed to recover control of the Suez Canal following nationalism by Nasser in July 1956, its decline and exit from the Middle East was still far from a foregone conclusion. In the next two sections, we'll look at the British informal power in Iraq and delve deep into the British, Iraqi, regional and international factors that shaped decolonisation there. Page 350. Adenese resistance, nationalism and anti-colonialism. 5.1. The impact of federation and the rise of anti-colonial nationalism. The path to blood is a path to freedom. There is no nation in the world that has acquired its independence by kissing the shoes of its colonisers. Every nation has gained its independence through destruction, demolition, and its dignity and honour by force. So march forward, O great nation. In the occupied Yemi South, victory will be yours. In 1958, Arab nationalism was still on the rise, with Nasser translating his version of pan-Arab ideology into action, resisting Western control and backed at times by the USSR. Egypt had disrupted the old status quo in the Middle East. On 1st of February 1958, Nasser created the United Arab Republic by linking Egypt to Syria, not to be confused with the United Arab States, which was a short-lived confederation of the United Arab Republic, Egypt and Syria, and North Yemen, 1958 to 61. Later in the same year, Iraqi free officers inspired by Nasser overthrew Iraq's king. Nasser was particularly problematic for the Western powers as he asked for and received Soviet arms and supplies. These men then played a role during the revolution in Yemen on 26th of September 1962, one of the most significant events in the 20th century history of Southwest Arabia. The overflow of Yemen, Saif al-Islam al-Badr in Sana'a, and the declaration of Yemen Arab Republic by the Corps leader and the first president, Field Marshal Abdullah al-Salah, gave sustenance to the forces of Arab nationalism in Aden and saw many migrant workers from North Yemen and Somalia take to the streets in protest at the planned Merger, Edwards 2015, occurring the same day that the Aden legislature voted for the colony's accession to the Federation of South Arabia. It was to have divisive repercussions on the nature of anti-colonial agitation in Aden. In addition to rising popular agitation in Aden, there was also trouble in the protectorates from 1954 onwards. Yemen had long had designs on the protectorate states, encouraging periodic border incidents and the active encouragement of subversion and insurgency. The traditional method of countering these border incidents with punitive air bombardment did little strengthen tribal loyalty, which was increasingly dependent upon advice and subventions from their British advisors to keep their recalcitrant subjects in check.